Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. Imagine for a second that you are tasked with managing a billion-dollar municipal crisis.
Right, which is already an absolute logistical nightmare.
Oh, exactly. So you've got the budgets, the personnel, the policy frameworks, and all the federal mandates. But there is a massive glitch in your dashboard.
A pretty terrifying glitch, honestly.
Yeah. You are entirely missing the data on like 60% of the active solutions currently operating right there in your own city.
You're just flying blind.
Literally flying blind. You're making these sweeping funding decisions while completely unaware of, the largest structural support system carrying the weight of the whole crisis.
Right, and today we're dissecting a really fascinating case study from the Baylor Institute for Studies of Religion that exposes exactly this blind spot in American urban policy regarding homelessness.
Because it really is a critical operational failure, right? Like in how we view civic infrastructure as a whole.
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, when we look at urban poverty and, emergency crisis care, the standard narrative, the one heavily dictated by federal funding matrices and municipal planning boards, frequently just omits the foundational layer of care.
Which is wild to think about.
Yeah, we were talking about the true ground-level impact of faith-based organizations, or FBOs, across major American cities.
So if you're an urban policy student or a municipal budget director, or really just a citizen wondering why the unhoused population in your downtown corridor seems totally disconnected from the policy promises you hear during election cycles, well, this data completely reframes the conversation.
Totally. The Baylor study surveyed 11 major cities and basically bypassed the standard federal dashboards entirely.
Right. They wanted to look at what was actually happening on the ground.
Exactly. So we're going to explore the raw scope of this network, the multi-million-dollar economic ripple effects, and the very real philosophical friction between federal methodology and grassroots reality.
Yeah, and to really understand the magnitude of this blind spot, we have to establish the baseline the researchers were working from.
Right. Using data from January of 2015, the study anchored its context in this pretty stark reality that over 564,000 people were experiencing homelessness in America on any given night.
Over 500,000 individuals just, navigating the absolute margins of society.
Yeah, it's a staggering number.
And when you have a population that large in crisis, the immediate literal question of survival is, well, who is putting a roof over their heads tonight?
Right. Like if the temperature drops below freezing in Chicago or Denver, who is physically unlocking a door and turning on the heat?
Exactly. And the Baylor data reveals that faith-based organizations provide nearly 60% of all emergency shelter beds across those 11 surveyed cities.
60%.
Yeah.
That is a staggering majority stake in the public safety net.
It really is.
Especially for a sector that largely operates entirely outside of public tax funding. The study actually labels this network the safety net of all safety nets.
The safety net of all safety nets. I love that phrasing.
Right, because when an individual exhausts every other civic resource, or, when they age out of state programs, or they're turned away from municipal shelters due to capacity limits,
the organization that ultimately catches them is overwhelmingly faith-based.
Exact.
Now, the aggregate 60% is surprising enough, but when you look at the localized breakdowns, it alters the entire perception of civic responsibility.
Oh, absolutely. The local numbers are wild.
Yeah, like in Omaha, Nebraska, FBOs are providing 90% of the emergency shelter beds.
90%.
90%. And in Houston, Texas, it's 79%. Think about the municipal budget of Omaha.
Right. If that faith-based infrastructure vanished tomorrow, the city government would be tasked with replacing 90% of its emergency shelter capacity overnight.
It would just bankrupt their localized continuum of care. Instantly.
It would. And part of the reason this massive infrastructure goes unrecognized by the broader public is that, it isn't centralized.
Right. We aren't talking about a single federal agency with standardized branding across the country.
No, not at all. The FBO ecosystem is intensely decentralized.
Right.
It certainly includes legacy institutions with massive footprints like the Salvation Army and Catholic Charities, but
it also encompasses independent gospel rescue missions, right?
Yeah.
And regional Jewish family services, and even hyper-local single congregation efforts.
Exactly. They operate totally independently, they raise their own capital, and they execute their own strategic visions.
Okay, let's unpack this because that brings up a necessary clarification.
Sure.
When the term faith-based is thrown around in policy circles, it often triggers assumptions about, mandatory religious compliance.
Oh, heavily. People assume there's always a catch.
Right. But the study goes out of its way to define the actual operational spectrum of these organizations, mapping out how faith really interacts with the delivery of social services.
Yeah, the researchers mapped a very wide spectrum. On one end, you do have environments where participation in religious activities is structurally integrated into a recovery program.
Like a resident might be required to attend a chapel service or participate in a faith-based recovery curriculum as part of a long-term residential stay.
Exactly. But that is only one slice of the pie. The vast majority of the emergency shelter operations sit elsewhere on the spectrum.
Right. So if an organization doesn't actively proselytize but is motivated by faith, how does it fit into the broader civic infrastructure? There's a massive distinction between an organization that requires religious adherence from its clients and one whose staff is just motivated by their own faith to do the work.
Absolutely. Many of these FBOs offer religious activities like prayer or Bible study strictly on a voluntary basis.
So access to a bed or a meal is never contingent on participating.
Never. And further down the spectrum, you have FBOs that offer no explicit religious programming in their emergency shelters whatsoever.
Wow, really? So it's totally secular in presentation.
In presentation, yes. The faith element is entirely internal to the organization. It's the philosophical engine driving the board of directors and the primary catalyst for donor funding. But the outward service delivery looks identical to a secular municipal shelter.
It's kind of like looking at a concrete building.
Okay, how so?
Well, the city, the local government, the official continuum of care structures, that's the concrete you see. It's visible, you can touch it, you can map it.
Right.
But inside that concrete, holding the entire structure together so it doesn't collapse under sheer gravity, is the rebar. And the rebar is completely invisible from the outside.
That's a great analogy.
So if an FBO is providing beds simply out of a faith-based mandate to care for the vulnerable without aggressively proselytizing, they are functioning as that invisible structural rebar for the city's civic infrastructure.
They really are. The city relies heavily on that rebar, yet rarely integrates it into the architectural blueprints.
Right.
And historically, a large portion of these ministries, especially the traditional gospel rescue missions, adopted a sort of isolationist approach to municipal politics.
Because their institutional DNA was built on direct, immediate action, right?
Exactly. They raised private capital from local donors, acquired a building, and just started taking people in. They largely ignored the complex bureaucratic world of city council zoning debates and federal grant applications.
Which directly causes the dashboard glitch we talked about at the very beginning.
Yes, exactly.
Because these massive legacy networks put their heads down and worked independently for decades, the official federal tracking systems developed massive systemic blind spots.
And this is a profound issue for urban planners who actually rely on those federal dashboards. Consider the standard data sets. The point-in-time count, or PIT, and the housing inventory count, the HIC.
Right. Those are the primary metrics HUD uses to determine federal block grants and assess the national state of homelessness.
Yeah, and the Baylor study highlights that major high-capacity FBO programs are fundamentally absent from these counts.
Okay, we need to explain this because how can someone with no home, no job, and no assets suddenly disappear from the official homeless registry simply by walking through the doors of a faith-based recovery program?
It sounds impossible, but it happens constantly. Let's look at massive networks like Teen Challenge or the Salvation Army's Adult Rehabilitation Centers, the ARCs.
Okay, yeah. These are enormous residential addiction recovery campuses serving thousands of people who were literally sleeping on the pavement just days prior.
Right. Yet HUD frequently does not classify them as homeless.
Wait, how does the federal logic justify that? They are clearly unhoused individuals in an emergency intervention program.
It all comes down to the rigid federal definitions tied to funding matrices. The federal government defines a transitional housing bed based on very specific regulatory criteria, which are largely designed around the programs they directly fund.
I see. And organizations like the Salvation Army ARCs operate entirely outside of HUD funding.
Exactly. The ARCs are famously self-sustaining. They're primarily funded by the revenue generated from Salvation Army thrift stores.
So because they aren't taking federal tax dollars, they aren't obligated to conform to the federal reporting architecture.
That's part of it, yeah. Furthermore, because a resident in an ARC is receiving intensive, long-term addiction rehabilitation in a privately funded, structured residential setting, HUD's classification system often considers them institutionalized or temporarily housed for that duration.
Wow. So they are just totally removed from the PIT count.
Completely removed.
Mm-hmm.
The federal data treats them as if they have been successfully housed, when in reality they're in the middle of an intensive, high-stakes recovery process for a condition that explicitly caused their homelessness.
So what does this all mean for local governments? I mean, it's like trying to balance a family budget without knowing about a massive secret savings account. If cities don't know these programs exist, how can they coordinate effectively?
They can't. And if you are listening to this and you work in municipal budgeting or localized COVID planning, the implications are absolutely terrifying.
I can imagine.
Imagine trying to allocate a limited multi-million-dollar budget for addiction recovery beds, but your official dashboard tells you that you only have 1,000 homeless individuals in your city.
Okay.
Meanwhile, there are actually another 800 individuals deep in the throes of residential recovery at an unmapped FBO center.
Oh, man. So you might divert crucial public funding toward building a new, completely redundant facility for a demographic that is already being quietly served.
Yes, while completely ignoring a critical shortage in, say, psychiatric care or domestic violence shelters.
Because the data is just wrong.
Exactly. The Baylor researchers argue this lack of data integration deeply skews the national strategy. It basically creates a false topography of the crisis. Planners are making decisions based on a map that only shows half the terrain.
That is just, it's mind-blowing. But the impact of these FBOs goes far beyond just providing uncounted beds, right? It bleeds directly into the municipal balance sheet.
Oh, heavily. The economic footprint is massive.
Let's pivot to the economic reality. Because this deep dive is not just a sociological exploration. It is a real examination of hard economics. The study wanted to quantify the exact taxpayer return on investment when a faith-based organization successfully intervenes in a human life.
Right, and the researchers focused their economic analysis on what they term residential recovery and job readiness programs, or RRJR.
Which, in broader policy parlance, aligns closely with transitional housing.
Exactly. But it's important to note these are not overnight emergency shelters where someone leaves at 7 a.m.
Right, these are the immersive programs lasting anywhere from 6 months to 2 years.
Yes, designed to address the deep-rooted trauma, the active chemical dependencies, and the educational deficits that keep people trapped in extreme poverty.
And the methodology they use to calculate the economic impact is fascinating. Across the 11 surveyed cities, they looked at the outcomes of individuals who successfully completed these FBO residential recovery programs.
And then they calculated the taxpayer savings generated over the 3 years immediately following completion.
The total estimated savings generated by these localized FBO programs, $119 million.
$119 million. And to understand the efficiency of that number, we have to look at the operational cost required to produce it.
Right. What did it cost to save that much?
The total cost for these FBOs to run those successful interventions was $33.2 million.
Wow.
Yeah. When you analyze those figures, the FBOs are delivering a return on investment of 3.58 cents for every single dollar spent on operations.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. It is crucial to recognize where that $33.2 million came from.
Right, because it wasn't primarily tax revenue.
Exactly. It was overwhelmingly private philanthropy, individual donors, church congregations, local business grants.
So when the Baylor researchers isolated the ROI to look exclusively at the small fraction of government tax dollars actually invested in these specific FBO programs, the return absolutely skyrockets.
To what?
To $9.42 saved for every $1 of public money spent.
Oh, wow. 9.42 cents for every dollar. If you are an investor, a guaranteed 942% return over 3 years is totally unprecedented.
Unheard of.
But how do we arrive at these massive municipal savings? I mean, the study doesn't just rely on abstract estimations of, like, societal good.
No, not at all. They anchor that $119 million in highly specific, peer-reviewed economic and health services metrics.
Okay, let's break down the mechanical reality of those metrics. Because if you are a skeptical policymaker, you want to know exactly how one person achieving sobriety translates into municipal cash flow.
Absolutely. The study categorizes the savings into 3 primary buckets. The largest economic driver is the first bucket, sobriety, and healing from addiction.
Okay, and what's the number attached to that?
The researchers calculated a taxpayer savings of $21,745 per person per year who successfully maintained sobriety.
Nearly $22,000. You have to trace the cascade of events that make up that amount.
Well, when an individual is living on the street with an active, unmanaged chemical dependency, they are interacting with the absolute most expensive elements of the municipal grid.
Right. They are essentially forced to use the emergency room as their primary care.
Exactly. A single ambulance dispatch, followed by an intake at a county hospital ER, a few nights in a specialized detox ward, and the subsequent discharge can easily cost taxpayers thousands of dollars in uncompensated care.
Not to mention the frequent interactions with local law enforcement. You've got public intoxication citations, processing in the county jail, and the heavy administrative burden of public defenders and court dates.
Right. And when an FBO program breaks that cycle, those costs drop to near zero.
That's incredible.
The individuals stop cycling through the ER, they stop requiring police intervention, and the city avoids the massive downstream costs of state-funded clinical drug treatment programs.
So that single behavioral shift saves the municipality over $21,000 per individual.
Yep. Now, the second bucket focuses on acquiring life and job skills for stable employment. The study attaches a savings of $11,343 per person for this transition.
Okay, so this is a fundamental shift in a person's relationship to the state economy. You're moving an individual from being a net consumer of public resources to a net producer.
Exactly. The math here represents a reduction in state and local welfare dependence.
Because when a program graduate secures stable employment, they naturally transition off food assistance programs.
Right. They no longer require state-subsidized emergency housing vouchers, and crucially, they begin paying payroll and local sales taxes.
So it is a dual economic benefit. You get a sharp decrease in the public burden paired with a new infusion of tax revenue into the local economy.
You hit the nail on the head. Now, the third bucket is perhaps the most profound from a generational perspective, yet it represents a very tangible administrative savings, too.
What's the third one?
Family reunification. The researchers estimated $4,106 saved per successful program completer through family reunification.
This metric specifically targets the child welfare and foster care systems, right?
Yes. The study highlighted programs like Wheeler Mission Ministries Outreach for Women. They noted that roughly 25% of the women who successfully complete their residential recovery program are able to regain custody of their children from Child Protective Services.
Wow, 25%. And look, the foster care system is an incredibly vital safety net, but it is financially and administratively exhausting for state governments.
Terribly exhausting. So by rehabilitating the parent, the FBO is effectively intervening in the child's trajectory as well.
The state saves years of monthly foster care stipends, the heavy administrative costs of continuous social worker case management, and all those legal fees associated with family court oversight.
Exactly. And averaged out across all successful graduates, it yields that $4,000 savings per person.
So when you view these three buckets comprehensively, the massive reduction in emergency medical and criminal justice costs, the transition away from welfare dependence, and the stabilization of families, it becomes undeniably clear that FBOs are functioning as a massive shadow economic engine for these municipalities.
Without a doubt.
Which raises an immediate, really logical question. If these privately funded organizations are quietly saving cities $119 million and generating a $9.42 ROI on public dollars, you would assume local mayors and federal HUD directors are aggressively funneling grants their way.
You really would.
You would expect massive collaborative partnerships, yet the reality on the ground is often characterized by intense friction and philosophical standoffs. Are cities actually recognizing this economic windfall, or are FBOs just silently absorbing the city's financial burdens?
It's mostly the latter, unfortunately, and this friction sits at the very core of current urban policy debates. We are looking at a fundamental clash of methodologies here.
Okay, let's get into this clash. It's a conflict between the centralized, federally mandated housing first approach and the grassroots, FBO-driven holistic recovery model.
Exactly.
And we really want to make sure we're examining the mechanics of both philosophies impartially, because housing first advocates and holistic recovery advocates both have extensive data sets and deeply held moral convictions about how to save lives.
Right, and the Baylor study highlights this conflict not to crown a victor, but to expose the operational gridlock it causes when municipalities attempt to execute a unified strategy.
So let's trace the rationale of the prevailing federal mandate first.
Sure. Over the last couple of decades, HUD has heavily pivoted its funding architecture toward the housing first methodology.
And the philosophical foundation here is that homelessness is, at its root, a crisis of literal housing.
Exactly. Therefore, the most urgent humane intervention is to provide immediate, permanent housing without preconditions.
So the mechanics of housing first mean that an individual is not required to pass a drug test. They are not mandated to maintain sobriety, and they are not forced to participate in psychiatric treatment or job training as a condition of receiving the keys to an apartment.
Right. The logic is one of extreme harm reduction. Get them out of the elements, provide a stable physical foundation, and then offer voluntary supportive services once they are safe.
Conversely, the faith-based organizations operating on the ground view the crisis through an entirely different lens.
A completely different lens. From the perspective of a gospel rescue mission or a Salvation Army adult rehabilitation center, literal homelessness is rarely just a real estate problem.
Right. It is almost always the terminal symptom of deeper, untreated root causes.
Exactly. FBOs frequently use the term relational poverty. They argue that people don't end up sleeping on the pavement simply because they missed a rent payment.
They end up on the pavement because they missed a rent payment, and they have completely exhausted or burned bridges with every familial, social, and communal safety net they ever had.
Yes, and that's often due to severe untreated addiction or complex mental health crises.
So the FBO methodology, holistic recovery, is built on the premise that putting an individual who is actively battling a severe, life-controlling fentanyl addiction alone into an apartment without a high accountability support structure is not actually solving their crisis.
No, from their perspective, it is simply moving their crisis indoors.
And this is where the policy friction translates into financial gridlock, isn't it? Is this a situation of trying to put a square peg in a round hole?
Oh, absolutely. HUD heavily incentivizes and often restricts its continuum of care grants exclusively to organizations that rigidly adopt the housing first model.
So if an FBO runs a transitional housing program that requires a resident to maintain sobriety to keep their bed,
they are fundamentally disqualified from federal funding.
Wow. And the researchers captured a striking real-world example of this tension in Atlanta, right?
Yes, they interviewed Sergeant Janine Schmidt, the director of Red Shield Services for the Salvation Army in that city.
Her experience perfectly illustrates the disconnect between federal theory and operational reality. She explained that their programs funded by public dollars are meticulously compliant regarding voluntary religious participation. Like, no one is forced into a chapel service.
Right, but their entire operational model is still built on intense relational accountability and personal transformation.
Because the FBO model thrives on structure. It is designed to disrupt the chaotic lifestyle of chronic homelessness.
Exactly. They build sober communities, mandate participation in recovery curricula, and establish strict behavioral guidelines. But as Sergeant Schmidt noted, this high accountability approach is often viewed by centralized housing first administrators as creating artificial barriers to housing.
Which creates a really fascinating municipal dilemma. Consider the diverse demographics within a single city's unhoused population. You absolutely have chronically homeless individuals with severe, persistent mental illness who may never achieve functional sobriety or independence.
Right, and for them, a permanent housing first placement might be the only mechanism keeping them alive and out of the ER.
But simultaneously, that exact same city has a massive population of individuals whose homelessness is acutely tied to chemical dependency.
People who desperately need and often actively seek out the rigid, high accountability, sober environments that FBOs provide in order to rebuild their neurochemistry and life skills.
So the question the Baylor study provokes is, can a city dynamically fund a robust housing-first pipeline for one demographic while simultaneously utilizing and funding the highly effective, high ROI, holistic recovery pipeline for another?
That's the multi-million-dollar question. Or are the grant matrices so inflexible that a program demanding sobriety is completely starved of public capital, forcing them to operate entirely off the grid?
It seems like that inflexibility is precisely what drives so many of these massive FBO programs to rely solely on private philanthropy. They choose to forego federal dollars rather than compromise a recovery model they have refined over decades.
They do. Yet, despite this systemic exclusion, the study found that these FBOs are incredibly agile.
Yeah. Freed from the slow, bureaucratic machinery of federal policy changes, they are rapidly innovating at the grassroots level. It's like I compare the FBO network to an open-source tech community.
How so?
Well, each city is running its own local software patch to solve specific community bugs rather than waiting for a top-down federal update. They identify localized issues, problems unique to their city's economy or geography, and they independently engineer solutions.
That's a perfect way to describe it. And the researchers actually traveled to the 11 cities and documented exactly how this grassroots innovation manifests on the street.
Let's get into these city spotlights, because this brings all those abstract philosophies and giant numbers down to earth. Let's start with Houston.
Yeah, Houston, Texas offers a masterclass in localized innovation, specifically regarding the economics of transition. The researchers focused heavily on the Star of Hope mission, which recently completed a massive $65 million campus.
And this wasn't merely an expansion of emergency shelter beds, right? It was a fundamental redesign of how recovery intersects with the local real estate market.
Exactly. Hank Rush, the CEO of Star of Hope, identified a heartbreaking systemic failure.
What was happening?
Women with children would enter their downtown facility, endure the grueling process of addiction recovery, achieve stability, secure employment, and effectively rebuild their lives.
Which is an incredible success story.
It is. But upon graduation, they face the brutal reality of Houston's urban real estate market.
Oh, right. Downtown housing was entirely unaffordable for someone just re-entering the workforce.
Exactly. Consequently, these newly stabilized mothers were forced to relocate to cheaper, often severely under-resourced and less safe areas of the broader metroplex.
Which means that forced relocation destroys the exact support network they just spent a year building.
Yes. They lose their mentors, they have to pull their children out of the stable school environment, and they are thrust into isolation in environments that frequently trigger a relapse into poverty or addiction.
The sheer economic gravity of the city was just undoing all the recovery work.
Precisely. To counteract this, Star of Hope engineered the Cornerstone community concept. They built a sprawling campus that physically integrates transitional recovery programs with permanent, affordable housing.
So it's a seamless geographical transition. A family can graduate from the intensive recovery phase and move directly into an affordable apartment on the exact same campus.
Right. The children don't change schools. The mother doesn't lose her support network. They remain anchored in a healthy, nurturing ecosystem.
It is a brilliant, privately funded solution to a massive macroeconomic problem. And Houston didn't stop there, did they?
No, the Houston FBO network also tackled the systemic inefficiency of public intoxication. Historically, if Houston police encountered an unhoused individual who was severely intoxicated in public, their options were incredibly limited and universally expensive.
They could initiate an arrest and transport the individual to the county jail, or, if there were medical concerns, divert an ambulance to take them to an emergency room.
Right, and both options tie up municipal resources for hours.
So what was the FBO solution?
The FBOs collaborated to establish sobering centers. These are specialized, safe, clinically supervised environments specifically designed to manage acute intoxication.
Oh, wow. So police officers can just quickly drop an individual off at the sobering center in a matter of minutes, bypassing the jail processing or ER triage entirely.
Exactly. The officer immediately returns to patrol, the city saves thousands in processing and medical costs, and the individual receives care explicitly tailored to addiction rather than criminalization.
That is just so efficient. Okay, let's move north to Denver, Colorado. The innovation there shifts from specialized campuses to deep logistical integration.
Right. We noted earlier that FBOs historically operated in silos, disconnected from municipal infrastructure. Well, the Denver Rescue Mission actively demolished that wall, positioning itself as a highly integrated core civic partner.
The researchers documented how Denver Rescue Mission operates a temporary emergency shelter in direct, deliberate coordination with the city government.
It is a literal logistical partnership. The city actually provides the transit infrastructure municipal buses to physically move individuals from the downtown core to the rescue mission's specialized facility.
This represents the theoretical rebar and concrete working in intentional unison. The FBO isn't just a charity operating on an isolated corner. They are woven directly into the city's crisis response grid, collaborating actively with the police department, the mayor's office, and local business coalitions.
And to maintain that level of trust with secular and governmental partners, the Denver Rescue Mission recognized they had to speak the language of policymakers.
Oh, meaning data.
Exactly. The study noted their massive internal shift toward rigorous data collection and precise outcome tracking. They are proving their ROI in real time to the municipal partners relying on them.
Amazing. Now, down in Phoenix, Arizona, the localized innovations center around intake methodology and redefining the actual metrics of human rehabilitation.
Right. The Phoenix Rescue Mission recognized that the standard big box emergency shelter model, warehousing hundreds of individuals with vastly different traumas, addictions, and mental health profiles into a single massive room, was frequently counterproductive to actual healing.
Yeah, it's essentially a holding pattern rather than an intervention. So to solve this, they launched the RAP initiative, which stands for Rescue, Assess, and Place.
They transformed their intake process into a sophisticated triage center. Instead of simply assigning a cot, the RAP program conducts a comprehensive biopsychosocial assessment.
Wow. So case managers meticulously untangled the specific compounding factors that led to the individual's homelessness. Like, is it a life-controlling methamphetamine addiction? Is it an untreated schizophrenic episode? Or is it purely acute economic loss following a medical emergency?
Exactly. And once they identify the specific root cause, they divert the individual away from the general population shelter and place them into a highly personalized care program tailored exactly to their diagnosis.
It is precision care applied to emergency social services. And the study also closely examined the Phoenix Dream Center, right? Which offers a pretty radical departure from federal reporting standards.
They really do. They utilize a 3-tiered measurement of a successful graduate. And this is where the distinct nature of a faith-based intervention becomes highly visible.
Because when a federal agency evaluates a housing program, the metric is binary. Is the person housed or are they unhoused?
Right. But the Phoenix Dream Center uses a far more granular approach. The first tier is sociological success.
What does that entail?
They evaluate whether the individual has rebuilt healthy familial relationships, if they are engaging positively with their local community, and if they have completely ceased any criminal behaviors.
Okay, very comprehensive. And the second tier?
The second tier is socioeconomic success. This tracks closely with the economic ROI metrics we discussed earlier. Can the individual maintain stable, long-term employment? Do they possess the financial literacy to manage a personal budget, pay taxes, and consistently meet their rent obligations?
Both of those tiers are deeply pragmatic and align perfectly with what any secular municipal government would desire.
Yes, but it is the third tier, spiritual success, that fundamentally differentiates the FBO model from a government agency.
Right. Spiritual success measures whether the individual is actively maintaining a connection to a faith community. It asks if they have found a deeper, transcendent purpose and meaning for their life beyond mere survival.
Exactly. And whether they're utilizing spiritual disciplines like prayer, meditation, or theological study as active mechanisms to maintain their sobriety and psychological resilience.
Now, obviously, a federal grant administrator legally cannot and will not track a spiritual metric.
No, of course not.
But from the perspective of the Phoenix Dream Center, that spiritual grounding is the foundational bedrock. They argue that when the inevitable crises of life hit, when the graduate loses a job or faces a sudden family tragedy, it is the spiritual framework and the deep community ties that prevent the sociological and socioeconomic tiers from collapsing back into addiction and homelessness.
It is a completely different paradigm of what it means to restore a human being, which, of course, highlights the immense complexity of operating diverse methodologies within the same city grid.
Right. The varying definitions of success inevitably lead to cultural friction, which the researchers captured most vividly in their final city spotlight: Seattle, Washington.
Yes. But before we look at the cultural dynamics in Seattle, we have to highlight the incredible logistical patch they engineered for the healthcare system there.
Oh, the medical beds, yes. The Union Gospel Mission, or UGM, in Seattle identified a massive, deadly gap in the continuum of care regarding medical discharge.
The reality of urban healthcare is that unhoused individuals frequently require complex surgeries or experience severe illnesses requiring hospitalization.
Right, and eventually they stabilize enough to be clinically discharged.
However, while they may not require an intensive care unit, they are far too frail to be discharged back to a tent on the sidewalk or a standard overnight shelter mat where they have to leave at dawn.
Which is horrifying. If a hospital discharges a frail, recovering patient to the street, the exposure and lack of sanitation almost guarantees they will suffer complications, requiring an emergency readmission within days.
It's devastating for the patient and financially ruinous for the hospital system, which faces massive federal penalties for high readmission rates.
So UGM intervened by dedicating an entire floor of their downtown facility exclusively for medical recuperative beds.
They built a stable, clinical, residential environment staffed to support fragile individuals. Patients can safely heal, manage their post-operative medications, and recover in a specialized environment that bridges the gap between acute hospital care and standard shelter life.
It is an elegant, highly effective solution that saves the regional healthcare system millions of dollars.
Millions.
But alongside these operational successes, Seattle is also where the Baylor study documented a profound observation regarding the cultural clash between FBOs and the broader progressive civic environment.
Right. The researchers conducted an in-depth interview with Major Philip Smith, the Director of Social Services for the Salvation Army in Seattle.
And his observations perfectly encapsulate the philosophical friction between a city's dominant political culture and the historical methodology of faith-based recovery. And again, we want to present his observations neutrally, exploring how differing sociological worldviews directly impact the delivery of social services.
Absolutely. Major Smith observed that the broader civic culture in Seattle is driven by an intense desire for compassion. However, he argued that the specific nature of this compassion ironically hinders the actual reduction of the homeless population.
How so?
He noted that the community consensus leans heavily toward viewing homelessness almost as an entitlement, a valid lifestyle choice that the individual has an autonomous right to pursue.
And if the civic culture views living on the street as a fundamental human right, the municipal objective shifts away from ending the behavior and focuses instead on making the lifestyle as safe and comfortable as possible.
Exactly. The public policy becomes centered entirely on meeting immediate basic needs, ensuring dignity within the encampments, and aggressively removing any punitive measures or requirements for behavioral change.
So Major Smith articulated that this perspective, while undoubtedly well-intentioned, practically serves to enable the individual to remain trapped in their condition.
Right, because if the city removes all friction from the lifestyle and demands no accountability, it minimizes any external incentive for the individual to seek out stabilization options, enter grueling addiction treatment, or do the difficult psychological work required for holistic recovery.
He summarized the tension perfectly, stating, "The challenge for us as a faith-based organization is to respond to the culture without compromising our mission."
Because the FBO's mission is fundamentally disruptive. They do not exist to make an individual comfortable while they slowly die of a fentanyl addiction on the sidewalk. Their mission is to disrupt that trajectory entirely.
They demand accountability, they require sobriety in their programs, and they aggressively drive toward total life transformation.
It represents a profound clash between a civic culture prioritizing ultimate personal autonomy and harm reduction versus an FBO culture prioritizing structured accountability and holistic restoration.
And that tension is playing out in city council chambers and continuum of care boardrooms across every major metropolitan area in the country. The local government and the voting public may be heavily invested in a philosophy of absolute autonomy.
While the FBOs, who, as the data proves, are quietly providing 60% of the actual emergency beds, are operating on a philosophy of life transformation.
It is a highly complex, often dysfunctional dance, which brings us full circle to the core objective of our exploration today. We set out to bypass the standard narratives and examine the true, unvarnished impact of faith-based organizations in managing the American homelessness crisis.
And when you look comprehensively at the data the Baylor researchers extracted, the sheer magnitude of this hidden infrastructure is undeniable.
We discovered that these organizations are the invisible rebar within the civic concrete, bearing the weight of nearly 60% of the emergency safety net across these 11 major cities.
And carrying an astonishing 90% of the load in places like Omaha.
We analyze how rigid federal funding definitions create massive data blind spots, leaving enormous, highly effective programs like the Salvation Army Adult Rehabilitation Centers completely uncounted.
Which directly skews how municipalities understand and fund their own crises.
We mapped out the shadow economic engine these organizations provide, delivering an astonishing ROI of $9.42 for every public dollar invested.
They are saving taxpayers an estimated $119 million, not through abstract accounting tricks, but by doing the agonizing, localized work of treating root causes.
Breaking the cycle of emergency room reliance, moving individuals from welfare to the workforce, and halting the generational trauma of the foster care system.
We also navigated the deep philosophical divide between the centralized harm reduction focus of federal housing first mandates and the highly structured relational recovery first models championed by the FBOs.
And finally, we saw how the agility of being privately funded allows these organizations to operate as rapid innovators. From Houston's cornerstone real estate patch to Denver's logistical transit integration to Phoenix's biopsychosocial triage to Seattle's medical recuperative care.
They are actively engineering solutions to localize civic failures. And the relevance of this data extends far beyond academic curiosity. It directly impacts how a community functions.
Exactly. If you are examining your local property tax assessments, if you are walking past an encampment in your downtown corridor, or if you are simply considering where to allocate your charitable giving, this study fundamentally shifts the landscape.
The visible civic structure, the municipal buildings, the HUD press releases, the city council mandates, represents only a fraction of the actual response network.
The reality exposed by the Baylor Institute is that an invisible, highly motivated, faith-based infrastructure is bearing a massive, disproportionate load for your community.
They are executing this work quietly, they are funding it largely with private dollars, and they are measuring their success with metrics that go far beyond simply providing a physical roof. They are attempting the infinitely more complex task of restoring the whole person.
It forces a reevaluation of how we structure public-private partnerships and how rigid federal mandates might be inadvertently stifling the most effective, highest ROI programs operating within city limits.
It really does.
Which leaves us with a final lingering scenario to consider. We talked at the very beginning about the comfort of looking at a precise map of a city's infrastructure, trusting that the system is fully understood and managed.
Right.
But based on the data we have unpacked today, imagine if tomorrow, due to a massive economic shift or a legislative stroke of a pen, every single faith-based organization in your city suddenly ceased operations.
The gospel rescue missions lock their doors. The Salvation Army shelters go dark. The faith-based addiction recovery centers are forced to discharge everyone back to the pavement.
Could your local government realistically absorb 60% of the emergency shelter demand overnight? Could a municipal COSI board recreate the intensely relational, holistic recovery programs and mobilize the tens of thousands of volunteer hours that power them from scratch?
It's a daunting question.
Or is there something entirely unique about that spiritual success metric we discussed, that deep human, faith-driven motivation to serve the broken, that a civic bureaucracy simply cannot replicate, no matter how much tax revenue they throw at the problem? The safety net is currently holding, but it is absolutely essential that we understand who is actually holding the net.